Hello everyone. Welcome to my first episode of the stories I like to read. Today is probably the best day for me to begin this first episode, and my first obvious choice of author was Rabindranath Tagore. And why it was obvious, I'll tell the reason some other day. My heart longs to read his short stories. All alone, all by myself, to be lost in the thoughts that he weaved, to be lost in the world that he saw. If that for some time is a healthy promise of a better world. I am reading the story Cabuliwallah from his book of short stories called Golpoguccho, which was originally written in Bengali but have been translated into English. I am reading this story from a translated book called Selected Stories of Rabindranath Tagore. Cabuliwallah is a Bengali short story, as I already mentioned, by Rabindranath Tagore, written in 1892. The story is about the fruit seller, a Pathan from Kabul, Afghanistan, who visits to Calcutta, which is now pronounced as Kolkata, in India, each year for selling dry fruits. And while living in India, he develops a filial affection with a 5-year-old girl, Minnie, from a middle-class aristocratic family. So just let's dive into the story and see what the Nobel laureate has in store for us. The Cabuliwallah. My 5-year-old daughter, Minnie, cannot leave without chattering. I really believe that in all her life she has not wasted a minute in silence. Her mother is often vexed at this and would like to stop her prattle, but I would not. For Minnie to be quiet is unnatural, and I cannot bear it long. And so my own talk with her is always lively. One morning, for instance, when I was in the midst of the 17th chapter of my new novel, my little Minnie stole into the room and, putting her hand into mine, said, "Father, Ramdayal, the doorkeeper, calls a crow a crow. He doesn't know anything, does he?" Before I could explain to her the difference between one language and another in this world, she had embarked to the full tide of another subject. "What do you think, Father? Bhola says there is an elephant in the clouds blowing water out of his trunk, and that is why it rains." And then darting off anew while I sat still trying to think of some reply to this, "Father, what relation is mother to you?" With a grave face, I contrived to say, "Go and play with Bhola, Minnie. I am busy." The window of my room overlooks the road. The child had seated herself at my feet near my table and was playing softly, drumming on her knees. I was hard at work on my 17th chapter, in which Pratap Singh, the hero, has just got Kanchanlata, the heroine, in his arms and is about to escape with her by the 3rd-story window of the castle, when suddenly Minnie left her play and ran to the window crying, "A Cabuliwallah! A Cabuliwallah!" And indeed, in the street below, there was a Cabuliwallah, walking slowly along. He wore the loose, soiled clothing of his people and a tall turban. He carried a bag on his back and boxes of grapes in his hand. I cannot tell what my daughter's feelings were when she saw this man, but she began to call him loudly. "Ah," thought I, "he will come in, and my 17th chapter will never be finished." And that very moment the Cabuliwallah turned and looked up at the child. When she saw this, she was overcome by terror and running to her mother's protection, disappeared. She had a blind belief that inside the bag which the big man carried, there were perhaps 2 or 3 other children like herself. The peddler, meanwhile, entered my doorway and greeted me with a smile. So precarious was the position of my hero and my heroine that my first impulse was to stop and buy something, since Minnie had called the man to the house. I made some small purchases and we began to talk about Abdur Rahman, the Russians, the English, and the frontier policy. As he was about to leave, he asked, "And where is the little girl, sir?" And then, thinking that Minnie must get rid of her false fear, I had brought her out. She stood by my chair and looked at the Cabuliwallah and his bag. He offered her nuts and raisins, but she would not be tempted and only clung closer to me with all her doubts increased. This was their first meeting. A few mornings later, however, as I was leaving the house, I was startled to find Minnie seated on a bench near the door, laughing and talking with the great Cabuliwallah at her feet. In all her life, it appeared, my small daughter had never found so patient a listener, save her father. And already the corner of her little sari was stuffed with almonds and raisins, the gift of her visitor. "Why did you give her those?" I said, and taking out an 8-anna piece, I handed it to him. The man accepted the money without demur and put it into his pocket. Alas! On my return, an hour later, I found the unfortunate coin had made twice its own worth of trouble. For the Cabuliwallah had given it to Minnie, and her mother, catching sight of the bright round object, had pounced on the child with, "Where did you get that 8-anna piece?" "The Cabuliwallah gave it to me," said Minnie cheerfully. "The Cabuliwallah gave it to you?" cried her mother, greatly shocked. "Oh, Minnie, how could you take it from him?" I entered at that moment, and saving her from impending disaster, proceeded to make my own inquiries. It was not the first or the second time I found that the two had met. The Cabuliwallah had overcome the child's first terror by a judicious bribe of nuts and almonds, and the two were now great friends. They had many quaint jokes which amused them greatly. Minnie would seat herself before him, look down on his gigantic frame in all her tiny dignity, and with her face rippling with laughter, would begin, "Oh, Cabuliwallah, Cabuliwallah, what have you got in your bag?" And he would reply, in the nasal accents of the mountaineer, "An elephant." Not much cause for merriment perhaps, but how they both enjoyed the fun. And for me, this child's talk with a grown-up man had always in it something strangely fascinating. Then the Cabuliwallah, not to be behindhand, would take his turn. "Well, little one, and when are you going to your father-in-law's house?" Now nearly every small Bengali maiden had heard long ago about her father-in-law's house. But we were a little newfangled and had kept these things from our child, so that Minnie at this question must have been a trifle bewildered. But she would not show it, and with ready tact replied, "Are you going there?" Amongst men of the Cabuliwallah's class, however, it is well known that the words father-in-law's house have a double meaning. It is a euphemism for jail, the place where we are well cared for, at no expense to ourselves. In this sense, would the sturdy peddler take my daughter's question. "Oh," he would say, shaking his fist at an invisible policeman, "I will thrash my father-in-law." Hearing this and picturing the poor discomfited relative, Minnie would go off into peals of laughter in which her formidable friend would join. These were autumn mornings, the very time of year when kings of old went forth to conquest, and I, without stirring from my little corner in Calcutta, would let my mind wander over the whole world. At the very name of another country, my heart would go out to it, and at the sight of a foreigner in the streets, I would fall to weaving a network of dreams. The mountains, the glens, and the forests of his distant land, with his cottage in their midst, and the free and independent life. Or faraway wilds. Perhaps scenes of travel are conjured up before me and pass and repass in my imagination all the more vividly because I lead an existence so like a vegetable that a call to travel would fall upon me like a thunderbolt. In the presence of this Cabuliwallah, I was immediately transported to the foot of arid mountain peaks with narrow little defiles twisting in and out amongst their towering heights. I could see the string of camels bearing the merchandise and the company of turbaned merchants, some carrying their queer old firearms and some their spears journeying downward towards the plains. I could see. But at some such point, Minnie's mother would intervene and implore me to beware of that man. Minnie's mother is unfortunately very timid. Whenever she hears a noise in the streets or sees people coming towards the house, she always jumps to the conclusion that they are either thieves or drunkards or snakes or tigers or malaria or cockroaches or caterpillars. Even after all these years of experience, she is not able to overcome her terror. So she was full of doubts about the Cabuliwallah and used to beg me to keep a watchful eye on him. If I tried to lull her fear gently away, she would turn round seriously and ask me solemn questions. Were children never kidnapped? Was it not true that there was slavery in Kabul? Was it so very absurd that this big man should be able to carry off a tiny child? I urged that. Though not impossible, it was very improbable. But this was not enough, and her dread persisted. But as it was a very vague dread, it did not seem right to forbid the man to the house, and the intimacy went on unchecked. Once a year in the middle of January, Rahman the Cabuliwallah used to return to his own country, and as the time approached, he would be very busy going from house to house collecting his debts. This year, however, he could always find time to come and see Minnie. It might have seemed to a stranger that there was some conspiracy between the two, for when he could not come in the morning, he would appear in the evening. Even to me, it was a little startling now and then suddenly to surprise this tall, loose-garmented man laden with his bags in the corner of a dark room. But when Minnie ran in smiling with her, "Oh, Cabuliwallah, Cabuliwallah," and the two friends, so far apart in age, subsided into their old laughter and their old jokes, I felt reassured. One morning, a few days before he had made up his mind to go, I was correcting proof sheets in my study. The weather was chilly. Through the window, the rays of the sun touched my feet, and the slight warmth was very welcome. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and early pedestrians were returning home with their heads covered. Suddenly I heard an uproar in the street, and looking out saw Rahman being led away, bound between two policemen, and behind them a crowd of inquisitive boys. There were blood stains on his clothes, and one of the policemen carried a knife. I hurried out, and stopping them, inquired what it all meant. Partly from one, partly from another, I gathered that a certain neighbor had owed the peddler something for a Rampuri shawl, but had denied buying it, and that in the course of the quarrel Rahman had struck him. Now in his excitement, the prisoner began calling his enemy all sorts of names, when suddenly in a veranda of my house appeared my little Minnie, with her usual exclamation, "Oh, Cabuliwallah, Cabuliwallah!" Rahman's face lighted up as he turned to her. He had no bag under his arm today, so that she could not talk about the elephant with him. She therefore at once proceeded to the next question. Are you going to your father-in-law's house? Rahman laughed and said, That is just where I am going, little one. Then, seeing that the reply did not amuse the child, he held up his fettered hands. Ah, he said, I would have thrashed that old father-in-law, but my hands are bound. On a charge of murderous assault, Rahman was sentenced to several years' imprisonment. Time passed and he was forgotten. Our accustomed work in the accustomed place went on, and the thought of the once free mountaineer spending his years in prison seldom or never occurred to us. Even my little light-hearted Minnie, I am ashamed to say, forgot her old friend. New companies filled her life. As she grew older, she spent more of her time with girls. So much, indeed, did she spend with them that she came no more as she used to do to her father's room, so that I rarely had any opportunity of speaking to her. Years had passed away. It was once more autumn, and we had made arrangements for our Minnie's marriage. It was to take place during the Puja holidays. With Durga returning to Kailash, the light of our home also would depart to her husband's house and leave her father's in shadow. The morning was bright. After the rains, it seemed as though the air had been washed clean and the rays of the sun looked like pure gold. So bright were they that they made even the sordid brick walls of our Calcutta lanes radiant. Since early dawn, the wedding pipes had been sounding, and at each burst of sound, my own heart throbbed. The wail of the tune, Bhairavi, seemed to intensify the pain I felt at the approaching separation. My Minnie was to be married that night. From early morning, noise and bustle had pervaded the house. In the courtyard there was the canopy to be slung on its bamboo poles. There were chandeliers with their tinkling sound to be hung in each room and veranda. There was endless hurry and excitement. I was sitting in my study, looking through the accounts, when someone entered, saluting respectfully, and stood before me. It was Rahman, the Cabuliwallah. At first I did not recognize him. He carried no bag. His long hair was cut short and his old vigor seemed to have gone. But he smiled, and I knew him again. When did you come, Rahman? I asked him. Last evening, he said. I was released from jail. The words struck harshly upon my ears. I had never before talked with one who had wounded his fellow man, and my heart shrank within itself when I realized this, for I felt that the day would have been better omened had he not appeared. There are ceremonies going on, I said, and I am busy. Perhaps you could come another day? He immediately turned to go, but as he reached the door, he hesitated and said, May I not see the little one, sir, for a moment? It was his belief that Minnie was still the same. He had pictured her running to him as she used to do, calling, Oh, Cabuliwallah, Cabuliwallah. He had imagined too that they would laugh and talk together just as of old. Indeed, in memory of former days, he had brought, carefully wrapped up in a paper, a few almonds and raisins and grapes, obtained somehow or other from a countryman for what little money had gone. I repeated, there is a ceremony in the house and you will not be able to see anybody today. The man's face fell. He looked wistfully at me for a moment, then said, Good morning, and went out. I felt a little sorry, but would have called him back, but I found he was returning of his own accord. He came close up to me and held out his offerings with the words, "I have brought these few things, sir, for the little one. Will you give them to her?" I took them and was going to pay him, but he caught my hand and said, "You are very kind, sir. Keep me in your memory. Do not offer me money. You have a little girl. I too have one like her in my own home. I think of her and bring this fruit to your child, not to make a profit for myself." Saying this, he put his hand inside his big loose robe, and brought out a small and dirty piece of paper. Unfolding it with great care, he smoothed it out with both hands on my table. It bore the impression of a little hand, not a photograph, not a drawing, merely the impression of an ink-smeared hand laid flat on the paper. This touch of the hand of his own little daughter he had carried always next to his heart, as he had come year after year to Calcutta to sell his wares in the streets. Tears came to my eyes. I forgot that he was a poor Kabuli fruit seller while I was... But no, what was I more than he? He also was a father. That impression of the hand of his little Parvati in her distant mountain home reminded me of my own little Minnie. I sent for Minnie immediately from the inner apartment. Many difficulties were raised, but I swept them aside. Clad in the red silk of her wedding day, with the sandal paste on her forehead and adorned as a young bride, Minnie came and stood modestly before me. The Cabuliwallah seemed amazed at the apparition. He could not revive their old friendship. At last he smiled and said, "Little one, are you going to your father-in-law's house?" But Minnie now understood the meaning of the word father-in-law, and she could not answer him as of old. She blushed at the question and stood before him with her bride-like face bowed down. I remembered the day when the Cabuliwallah and my Minnie had first met, and I felt sad. When she had gone, Brahman sighed deeply and sat down on the floor. The idea had suddenly come to him that his daughter too must have grown up while he had been away so long, and that he would have to make friends anew with her also. Assuredly he would not find her as she was when he left her. And besides, what might not have happened to her in these 8 years? The marriage pipes sounded, and the mild autumn sunlight streamed around us, but Rahman sat in the little Calcutta lane and saw before him the barren mountains of Afghanistan. I took out a currency note, gave it to him and said, "Go back to your daughter, Rahman, in your own country, and may the happiness of your meeting bring good fortune to my child." Having made this present, I had to curtail some of the festivities. I could not have the electric lights I had intended, nor the military band, and the ladies of the house were despondent about it. But to me, the wedding feast was all the more brighter for the thought that in a distant land, a long-lost father had met again his only child. Thank you.